Yeah, so just a quick outline overview of what we're going to do today. There'll be a lecture portion for the majority of it. We're going to talk about 4 things. There's going to be a food overview, right? So defining what is food for the purposes of this talk and purposes of my research. Talk about sensory neuroscience, right? Understand how we detect what food is and the important parts. We'll talk about food evaluation, right? So understanding and then valuing things are a different process. It's important. And then ultimately, we're going to lead up to behavior, right? So how do we do these food choices and how do we make decisions? And then we'll have kind of a brief discussion at the end, just kind of about our favorite foods. If you haven't had time to kind of list up a few of your favorite foods, maybe think about that during the presentation, either what your favorite, ultimate favorite food is or a few of your favorites. You just want to have something in our mind to kind of think of and think about how we interact with it when we enjoy our favorite things to eat. And then we'll also briefly discuss the future of food, and I'll share some resources. So let's get into it. Cool. So here's the lecture and the next slide as well. So food overview, key concepts and definitions. Go to the next slide. So what is a food, right? It's not necessarily a difficult question, but it's actually more complicated than you might think. And so just pop up the next picture. Right, so vegetables, I think everyone would assume those are foods. We got next up, I believe, is fish and chips. Obviously, I'd say is food. Next, I think there's a hamburger. We could say that's food as well. And then some salmon, right? These are all absolutely food. I think that almost everyone would agree. But what about water, right? Is that food? It's something we need, but maybe it's a bit different. And then what about something like sparkling water, right? Especially if it has a flavor like LaCroix. Is that food? And what about something like alcohol? Does that count as food? And then finally, what about something like gummy vitamins? Do those count as foods or are they something different? All right. So the point of this was just to say, hey, maybe our definition of what is food is a little more complicated, right? What it means for us to just eat, I'm hungry, I want some food, and what the body thinks is food might be a little bit different. So for today, we're going to define food really clearly, right? So being at Oxford, we're going to use the Oxford English Dictionary, and we're going to define food as nourishment, which is what comes directly out of it. Specifically, definitions 1.1a and 1.1b, which are that any nutritious substance is a food that people or animals eat or drink in order to maintain life and growth. So it's nourishment or provisions. And then also want to define that we're going to talk about solid nourishment as opposed to drink. But that might be interesting later. So what's in a food, right? Foods are made up of nutrients. And what are nutrients? There are 6 key types of nutrients, right? So there are carbohydrates or sugars, there's protein, fat, and there's vitamins and minerals, and then there's water. So according to this, maybe water is a food. Carbohydrates, protein, and fat are known as macronutrients, quite simply because we need a macro amount. The body needs a lot of these to function. And vitamins and minerals are known as micronutrients because the body does need them. They're very important, but it doesn't need quite as much. And water, like I said, is also a nutrient. So just going through these briefly, macronutrients, we're going to look at carbohydrates, right? So carbohydrates are sugars and usually have the form C6H12O6 in some kind of way as a basic set. So there are 4 key classes of carbohydrates. There's the monosaccharides, which are the simple sugars. There's disaccharides, which are just built up 2 monosaccharides. And so these are very common, right? So table sugar, what you'd put in your tea or your coffee, is a disaccharide, is sucrose. There are many different kinds of sugars. Monosaccharides are the simple sugars that you find in fruit. Disaccharides are slightly more complex, right? So they're just 2 monosaccharides combined. That's like what you have in table sugar. There's oligosaccharides, which aren't really relevant for today. And then polysaccharides are energy storage, right? So cellulose or things like glycogen in plants. All right, so now on slide 8. We have fats, and fats are really important because they do many, many critical functions for the body. Right? So they help in vitamin absorption. We'll talk about that later. They help with energy storage as well. They help with heat retention. They do really important things like building hormones in our body. And there are 3 key types of fat. And so the 3 types of fat, there's saturated fat, there's unsaturated fat, which is the quote unquote healthy fats, and then there's trans fats. And trans fats have been, for all intents and purposes, actually quite successfully eliminated from much of the United Kingdom diet due to efforts in the past decades or so. But you see on the top right-hand corner on slide 8, there's a piece of butter, and that's a saturated fat. So, there's some discourse about fats being not healthy, but they're actually very important as well. And then moving on to slide 9, we have Protein, right? So proteins are compounds that contain amino acids. There are 20 biologically important amino acids, and they are crucial for human physiological function. And here's a great quote from LaPalooza and Kashik's paper from a few years ago, saying that proteins provide the body's building blocks. They are the precursors of several biologically relevant molecules, and that deficiencies of proteins can lead to disease, nervous system defects, metabolic problems, organ failure, and even death. So very important for us to get our proteins. I have an image in the top right of a steak, right? Because the animally bioavailable proteins are very common. That's kind of what we think as being a protein, but you can also get proteins from other sources, right? There's whey. People who are into the fitness community often use whey protein. There's soy proteins. You can also get them from things like legumes, right? So beans. Moving on to slide 10. We start talking about the micronutrients, right? Now, so we have vitamins, and vitamins are organic compounds. That's the important difference between them and minerals, right? So some key vitamins, right, are vitamin A, vitamin B, C, D, E, and K. And we see these, right, a lot of times in the stores. You got to take your vitamins. We know that famously, right, vitamin C helps prevent against scurvy, which is something that used to affect people who would go on long sea journeys. I've highlighted vitamin A, D, E, and K because those are fat-soluble vitamins, and without fats present in our body, we have a very difficult time processing these. Also, vitamins are really important. They help us build, immune system functions and our hormones. Going on to slide 11. The minerals. So minerals are inorganic elemental compounds, right? And so some of the key minerals I have here are calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, magnesium. And I've highlighted calcium, phosphorus, magnesium because your body needs them in relatively large amounts. So the ones right present compared to the macronutrients, much less, but these are still critical for the body function. There's also trace minerals, and there's many others I've listed on the slide here that you all do need in little bits and pieces. But overall, these are less abundant in the body. And the key use, right, one of these is building bones, right? Calcium to drink your milk for that same reason. Slide 12, you think about food and human health, right? So this is where we start to kind of use what we've learned so far just to think about human health as a whole, right? So what is the ideal diet, right? There's many things that people talk about as far as our quest to be healthy, right? People are vegetarian. There's moral reasons. There's also health reasons. People are vegan. There's the keto diet you may have heard of, the Paleolithic diet or the caveman diet, and there's many more, right? There's constantly people coming up and trying to think of better ways for us to eat because food is very important. But my point here I want to make is just that there's lots of competing opinions on what the optimal diet is. But how do we really know? I think the answer is that we're not quite there yet, and it's a really interesting field. But what I do want to highlight is something that we do know, which is that there's a lot of risks of poor dieting behavior, right? So disordered eating is a massive problem for both over and under consumption. It's really damaging, and it's really important that we focus and make sure that we do eat healthily, because dysfunction in food choice can lead to many diseases, but it's also not just present in humans, right? There's observed across animals in the animal kingdom and humans as well. Also, suboptimal eating patterns are very common. Okay, wonderful. I think we're going to be a little bit better on the slides. So basically the point is that, right, disordered eating is quite common, but we still don't know exactly how to fix it, right? And so obesity cases have tripled between the years of 1975 to 2016 from the World Health Organization, and have likely continued that increase. There's also really interesting things related to nutrient starvation. And so one UK study by Butler found that food deserts were very common in the United Kingdom, that more than 1 million UK residents live in food deserts, which means that they're not able to access quality food. This is very common in major cities as well. And the genetics is also a very key aspect, which is that people do have specific genetic influences. It's not just behavior, not just choice. And so I want to highlight one example is the MC4R gene, which is the melanocortin 4 receptor expressing neuron gene. Vanderklaw et al. Is a research group. In 2016, they published a paper showing that people who had this gene missing in these neurons had extreme fat preference increase and almost no sugar preference, which is really fascinating because it was a really good example, one of the first really good examples in people of there being genetic causes of nutrient-specific hunger, right? So not just hungry for this or that, but that there was a fat-specific increase in dieting with this specific gene deletion. Also, one other really interesting study to highlight is a study that came out of Cambridge about 5 years ago, similar to the Butler study in food deserts, is that there's a correlation between how close you are to a supermarket and the decrease in your obesity risk. And so you might think that's a little bit backwards, that if you are closer to sources of food, you might overeat more often. But they found the opposite, that the farther away you are from a supermarket and access to diverse arrays of food and access to eat what you'd like to eat and you can self-regulate, then the greater your obesity risk comes, because you might be eating more processed foods. Well, there's many reasons. I'm not sure they went into it all the way. So it's very interesting. I just want to highlight it's more complex than just food in, food out. Moving on to slide 13 up first. So my goal, my research, is just to determine the neural mechanisms of food sensation and choice. And so I'm trying to understand exactly what the brain is doing, what parts of the brain are active when we're sensing these foods, evaluating these foods, and then making choices over time. So that kind of sums up just the key concepts on slide 13. We're going to move on to sensory neuroscience, which is how we detect food. So the sensation of food occurs through all 5 senses. And that's something I really want to highlight, is it's not just taste and not just smell, but all 5 senses do have an impact, right? And so we have taste is your tongue and the mouth, and smell is your nose, nasal passageways. We have touch, and for the purposes of this, I'm going to define touch as touch within the mouth, right? So how does something feel on your tongue? Is it thick? Is it slimy? Anything like that. Sight, the visual appearance of foods, and even hearing. Also, there's some really interesting research that shows that hearing impacts the way that food is for us as well. Moving on to slide 15, we're going to start just going through each one. So what is taste? Taste is the detection of compounds in the mouth via taste receptors. You have taste receptors all over your tongue and in other parts of your mouth. And they're very specialized cells, and they're found in something called taste buds. And there are 5 essential tastes, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, which is sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and then protein source, or umami. And there are 2 key sensation mechanisms. There's a lot more detail we can go into this, but just briefly for our purposes, the main sensation mechanisms used by these taste cells and the taste buds are the ones that function by GPCRs, which are G protein couple receptors, and that's sweet, bitter, and umami. And then there are ion channels, which are salty and sour. And so the GPCRs, the compounds touch these cells and they activate a G protein, which then releases calcium and ATP, which is an energy source, adenosine triphosphate in the intercellular area, which then sends a signal through neurons up to the brain. And then the taste receptor cells that have ion channels, there's an ion gradient inside and outside the cell in the mouth, and then that activates the flow into the cell or out of the cell, which then sends the signal. Moving on to slide 16, we have smell. Right, so smell is obviously very important for tasting and sensing food, and it's a detection of compounds via olfactory neurons, usually in the nose. And so odorants, right, which are these smells, these little molecules that carry the information about a smell, they bind to receptors in the cilia of the olfactory receptor cells up in here. And these cells then send information to the olfactory bulb, which then projects to the primary olfactory cortex in the brain. However, there's also further projections of smell information, which include the amygdala, insula, and the orbitofrontal cortex. We'll talk about all these areas later. And I want to talk about 2 specific things. So if you click once, orthonasal smell, right? Orthonasal smell is through the nostrils. It's what we think of smelling, right? It's what I have here on the right side of the slide. Smell of flour, yum, right? You inhale through your nostrils. That's orthonasal smell. There's also something called retronasal smell. And that's what happens when smells go through the back of your throat up into your nasal passageway, and you also smell in this way. So you smell once on the outside, you also smell when things are in your mouth or when you're swallowing them, which is a very interesting thing to think about as well. And critically, this retronasal smell, when smells come in this way, it also influences the taste cortex. The tasting part of your brain also picks up on these smells. So moving on to slide 17, I just want to highlight what flavor is. The concept of flavor, we're going to say, is the integration of taste and smell. Right? You might have noticed that when you're sick and you try to taste something, it's not as good as it usually is. It's because maybe your nose is clogged up and you don't have that smell impact as well. So just look on the left side of the slide here, we see smell. Like I mentioned, we have the odorants attaching to the cilia, which filter up through the olfactory receptor cells into the olfactory bulb. And then they go through the nerve fibers into the primary gustatory cortex and the primary smell cortex in the brain, you can see on the right. In the bottom right-hand corner, we see an example of a taste bud. And so you can see all these taste receptor cells kind of bundled together in different food molecules going and impacting them and sending signals via the nerve fiber to the brain. And so it's this interaction really that builds our perception of flavor. Going to slide 18. So then touch we have, right? And so touch is the detection of tactile information via mechanosensory neurons. And this is very complex and happens all over the body, but we want to talk about something that happens in the mouth, right? And so mechanosensory neurons carry many types of somatosensation, right? Detecting pleasant and unpleasant touch in all specific subgroups of things like that. Some examples are nociceptors, which are pain, proprioceptors, which kind of sense where your body is in space. And we have low threshold mechanoreceptors for really light, gentle touch, very important for social bonding and things like that. But also hair cells in the inner ear to kind of help you with your balance. They also sense mechanical movement and touch. And these neurons send tactile information to the primary somatosensory cortex, so up here in your brain. But for food sensation, right, we're looking at the texture properties in the mouth specifically. All right, moving on to slide 19, sight. So sight is the detection of visual information carried by light via the eyes. I'm sure we're all very familiar with this. Just briefly overviewing, right? Light travels through the pupils, hits the rods and cones in the retina, and these light-sensitive cells activate and they send visual information to the primary visual cortex at the back of your head via the optic nerve. And the information coming out of the signal here is processed heavily and creates this perception of sight. And there's, you're not actually seeing food in its you're not tasting food with your eyes, but the way that food looks is very important for how we eat it, right? You see something that looks yummy, you immediately have a response to it. Whereas you see something that looks gross, you might not have the same kind of response, right? You start salivating if you see something like a piece of cake that you might want to eat. If you see, I don't know, someone's dropped ice cream on the ground, you might not salivate, right? So context and visual information actually has a huge effect. On the way we perceive food. And one great example is the Coca-Cola red cans. I can't remember the exact study name, but people thought they tasted better when they were blinded, when they were drinking red Coca-Cola cans as opposed to black Coca-Cola cans because the color red. Moving on to slide 20, we finally have hearing. And so hearing is the detection of sound waves and vibration by the ears, right? And so briefly, sound waves travel into the ear canal, they vibrate the eardrum, and then that pressure pulses are transmitted into the inner ear. And then the frequency of the vibration transmitted is detected by hair cells in the cochlea, which is this little snail-shaped structure inside your head, and which detects the exact frequency, and then it sends it to a tonotopic map in the primary auditory cortex, which is interesting, showing that your brain has specific parts for specific sounds. And sound, I just wanted to touch on because there's some interesting research, especially out of a lab here, showing that there's an impact of kind of the ambiance where you are, what you're listening to when you eat things, and it can affect how you perceive food. So slide 21, a couple other aspects of food sensation I wanted to just briefly touch on are satiety or satiety. You know, one milkshake might be delicious, but four maybe is not so delicious, right? There's some kind of, you've had enough and you get full. There's also a thing called sensory specific satiety, which is that if you've had one thing, you aren't hungry for that one thing anymore. There's also, if you click again, temperature, right? So the temperature actually influences greatly your perception of food. Chemesthesis, irritation, is just one fun one to talk about, right? It's actually the spice flavor. It's irritating. Right? Things like capsaicin that irritate your tongue, and for some of us, it's quite exciting. It's quite enjoyable to have a bit of spice in our food. And also social and cultural influences, right? There are differences in the way that we perceive and we process food, just based on our upbringing and where we are in the world. So if you click on to slide 22, we're going to start talking about the brain, right? And so you have primary sensory processing, right? And I have the 5 highlighted here. So we have tastes in the primary gustatory cortex, touch, the primary somatosensory cortex, sight, the primary visual cortex, and then smell and hearing in the olfactory and auditory cortices. As you'd expect, these are all the primary. So information first enters the brain for these 5 senses in these areas that I've generally highlighted with just a little bit of color. If you click one more time, you'll see that the actual names for these areas. So the primary gustatory cortex is called the AI/FO for short, which is the anterior insula or frontal operculum. And so it's this area between these 2 parts of the brain near the fold on the side. And then the primary olfactory cortex is also known as the piriform cortex. And those are the 2 that I wanted to emphasize the most. If you click one more time, we're going to talk about further processing on slide 23. And so I've highlighted the orbital frontal cortex, which is the bit of your prefrontal cortex just kind of behind your eyes, and then the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, just a bit above that. And these are really important for the processing, right? The evaluation and then kind of deliberation, particularly the VMPFC, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. You click one more time, there's 3 other areas that are really important, the insular cortex, striatum, and amygdala. But these are inside the brain. I couldn't get a good image in time for the presentation to show where these are. These are not on the surface. They're more deeper brain structures, but they're all very important for kind of the processing of food and valuation. So on slide 24, right, just kind of a summary bit, food processing in the brain. We have the 5 primary senses that come in through the tongue, mouth, nose, eyes, and ears, and they all project, right, immediately that information enters the brain through primary processing in these primary regions, with the exception of smell, which goes to the olfactory bulb first. If you click once more, we have taste. I want to focus on, right, the primary gustatory cortex. And primary gustatory cortex has specific populations of neurons that represent the taste of foods, right? So what nutrients are in them, what's being detected by your tongue. And they also respond to texture and temperature and demonstrate chemesthesis, right? So even at this low level, there is some interaction. However, and importantly, the neurons in the primary gustatory cortex do not respond to visual or olfactory stimuli from orthonasal detection. Click once more, right? We see that there's also really interestingly sensory specific representations of these foods in key brain regions. So I mentioned earlier the orbital frontal cortex, right? So it's a little bit of a higher processing area, and it has taste, sometimes referred to as the secondary gustatory cortex. But we're just going to call it the orbital frontal cortex, or the OFC for short for this. But it also represents taste, smell, texture, appearance, and temperature. Right? So a lot of these things are starting to come together so they can be processed together. The amygdala, deeper brain structure, also has nutrient-specific oral texture, right? So it detects specifically fat in the amygdala. Then the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC, has also been found to detect temperature of foods when detected in the mouth specifically. So again, with further sensory processing, right, this information enters the brain and is represented in the primary areas and some secondary processing areas. But then we also have representation of multiple sensory modalities, right? Like I said, the primary gustatory cortex, sorry, this is slide 25. The primary gustatory cortex neurons also represent food texture, temperature, and chemesthesis, and they project to the orbital frontal cortex, which represents similar things. There's also integration of the sensory information. And the texture representation I was discussing in the primary gustatory cortex also indicates that there's somatosensory cortex inputs, right? So that's the texture. The texture projects to the somatosensory cortex, up bit on the parietal lobe, and it projects into the somatosensory cortex. Into the primary gustatory cortex, which is interesting that even at that primary processing level, there's already integration. The amygdala and orbital frontal cortex neurons also demonstrate convergence of texture and taste responses and odor and appearance responses, which helps us critically pass from sensation into perception, right? Because the perception is the creation of that kind of internal picture. Also, sensory representations and post-ingestive signals are integrated in the striatum. I briefly mentioned in the slide before with the brain. And the post-ingestive signals are really interesting because that's what happens after we've started to digest the food, that we're getting information percolating up towards our brain. And this image on slide 26 is about that post-ingestive signaling. And so this is quite complicated. We don't have to get into it too much, but I just want to highlight the fact that you look on the left, you see the nutrient fat, right, goes up, sensed in the digestive tract. There's activation of specific metabolic signalings. It goes to the vagus nerve, and it goes up through the brainstem, and then finally into the cortex, right, where the subjective evaluation in the prefrontal cortex, the MPFC areas, is being decided. And then on the other side of the person, we have the carbohydrate, right, or sugars, and we see something similar happening, but we don't understand exactly what's happening between what's going on in the stomach and the digestive tract, and then when it reaches the brain. Yeah, if you click one more, you'll see I've highlighted that. And then I also just want to circle this thing on the right side that says that there's other macro and micronutrient pathways as well, right? It makes sense that there would also be this for protein and for the vitamins and minerals that are critical to our body's function. So there's still a lot to understand, still a lot to learn. And as we progress farther, we see it is quite complicated and a lot of these signals interact. So key point takeaway here is just that this is a complicated process. So we move to slides 27, summary of sensory processing, right? Information essentially enters the brain first, largely separately, right, through our different five senses, and then into those primary cortices in the brain, which we talked about. If you click again, we see that sensory-specific representations occur in multiple brain regions, right? So there's specific taste, smell, texture, appearance, temperature that occur all in the same region and in the specific areas for primary processing. And then finally, you click like last time, you see that the senses do interact. And it's these interaction of the senses that gives rise to the subjective food perception, right? We all taste maybe a little bit differently. But critically, the primary gustatory cortex is where maybe the oral texture and the taste comes through. And then flavor is what we're going to indicate as the convergence of texture and taste and odor and appearance responses in the amygdala and the orbital frontal cortex. And moving on to slide 28, we're now going to switch into the food valuation part. So starting on slide 29, what makes a food desirable, right? Well, first, it's high in calories, right? We need energy. That's an essential piece of this all, is that we need calories in order to function and stay alive. Also, the qualities of its contents, right? So what nutrients is in it? If there's sugar content, there's fat content, there's protein, maybe certain vitamins. We crave things that are saltier. And then also the sensory properties, right? If something tastes sweet or tastes creamy, these are really rewarding to us, and we seek these specific qualities out, right? There's a reason we don't just drink, high protein smoothies that taste like nothing. We crave these specific tastes and these specific flavors, these specific combinations of food qualities. And finally, of course, we have physiological needs, right? So hunger, cravings for food, and thirst, cravings for water drive us strongly towards specific foods. And moving on to slide 30, right, I wanted to talk to the nutrient content, of course, like we just mentioned. Also, there are many different kinds of influences on desirability, right? So taste, smell, texture, appearance, like I mentioned before, the red Coca-Cola can, some people think tastes better, but also packaging. You can see plenty of examples of this in the real world with things like greenwashing. And they have beautiful pictures in the front of your milk carton, but maybe it's just the same milk, or it doesn't taste any different to another milk, but it's got a cute cow on it, and that makes you want to drink it, and you might believe it tastes better because of that. I mentioned before sound. The cross-modal perception laboratory here at Oxford with Professor Charles Spence does a lot on working and collaborating with certain upscale restaurants and seeing if the ambiance and the noises that are going on in the background as you eat something might change the way that it is. And they find that it does, which is very fascinating. And then, of course, like I mentioned before, temperature and then satiety do have specific effects. Edmund Rolls, who was previously at Oxford, did a lot on sensory-specific satiety, right? So that fourth milkshake might not taste good as the first. And like I mentioned before, social and cultural impacts are important. So the neural representation of reward, just briefly, right? We have the primary gustatory cortex, which we mentioned before, right? Was key for taste, but it also contains reward value neurons, which represents the reward value of foods that are sampled in the mouth, right? Which is interesting because these are separate. So it's in the same part of the brain, and we have neurons that signal the taste and the texture of these neurons in primary gustatory cortex. And we have neurons right near them that also are the reward value of those same foods, but they don't converge at this point, right? They converge later on in the orbitofrontal cortex or the secondary gustatory cortex. So from the very beginning, we're starting to represent evaluation. And this also occurs, right? So in key reward areas, right? So we have many overlapping systems in the brain, but these sensory representations and the food sensory process to these different parts of the brain are also, these areas are key reward regions, right? So the orbitofrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, the OFC and the ACC, and the amygdala. I just have some examples here on the slide, but these are key reward areas, but they're also doing a lot of the heavy lifting for sensory processes. So it's very interesting, right? And it makes sense that food would be an important thing like this, but there's a lot of overlap between the sensation of food and the reward processing of anything, just like food. If you click one more time, you see kind of this big yellow box at the bottom, and that's food as a reward. This idea that the reward value of food is represented in neural signals that can be related to specific sensory qualities of foods. And we find these in the orbitofrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex as well. Moving to slide 32, we're in the final section now, just looking at behavior. And slide 33, right? So just to review, we've gone over the key components of foods, how foods are sensed and evaluated in the brain, interaction between the senses, potential influences on choices, and the key brain areas involved in these processes. And so what behavior really is, I want to define it as decision making for foods, which emerges from the subjective evaluations of these foods, which that emerges from the sensation. On slide 34, we see how does decision making occur, right? So Camillo Petio-Schioppa is a founding member of this kind of area of work in neuroscience, and essentially claims that decision making is the computation of the subjective value of possible options, and then a comparison. So if I have food A and food B, I'll decide the value of food A to me and the value of food B to me based on all the factors we've talked about: nutrient sensation, caloric content, social and cultural factors. But I'll determine how much one of each is worth to me, and then I'll compare between them and select the best option at the time of choice. And that's how I would make my choice for food. Um, and what kind of things might influence this decision making? Right. So I mentioned the overlap of these reward areas with sensory processing. And so everything that influences the way the food tastes might also influence these decisions. There's also social things as well, right? If you go out to eat with your friends and everyone else orders a hamburger, you might feel inclined to order a hamburger as well to be a part of the group. So a recent study that I've done in my group is on human food choice. All right, so on slide 35, I go into this. We investigated how people made choices for different foods. And the foods we used were milkshakes. Right, so I keep using that example. So they're carefully designed liquid food rewards, is the scientific way to say it. If you look at the top right, you see this thing here, the high fat, low sugar, high sugar with the abbreviations. And generally the assumption that we had was that kind of increasing in blue color, right? That the more fat and the more sugar something had, the better reward it would be, right? So I have a really specific detailed slide here on the bottom left, kind of table going into the actual components, which were very carefully controlled for calories and even just the physical properties. But if we go to the next slide, on slide 36, the goal was to observe people making choices between different foods, and that these different foods would have interesting different qualities and nutrient compositions, but that we knew, so that we could take the nutrients and see if those predicted the choices. So we recorded behavioral results and also neural activity using fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging during a food choice task. And it's functional MRI because you basically take a single MRI, right? So a picture of the brain using magnets, but a bunch of little pictures over time to make a low resolution movie, essentially, of what's going on in the brain. If you click again on slide 36, we see that the people's choices observed were explained by calories, but also the specific nutrient components, so the fats and sugars of foods, and that people's choices were best explained by what they thought of these foods, right? So the key component there is it's not fat and sugar content that best predicted what people did. It was how sweet and how creamy they thought the foods were, which makes sense if you think about it from just a personal way, right? If someone tells you a food has something, that's maybe a little bit less important than how it tastes to you. But it's interesting to see this represented, scientifically. If you click one more time, we talk about the brain regions. So the oral frontal cortex, the amygdala, and the VMPFC signal the value of foods, as we expect. And the VMPFC signal value of the chosen food during the decision. And so we found the key brain regions we expected to happen also in the study. So it's very exciting research. To summarize, right, thank you everyone for coming in for the lecture. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. But briefly, I want to do a quick discussion that I'm not sure again if you've had time to think about your favorite foods, but at this point forward, please feel free to respond in the chat and we'll kind of discuss from there. But I want to go into, if you go to slide 38, favorite foods, right? So please feel free to message in the chat, what are your favorite foods, right? So I think my favorite food is either sushi or maybe macaroni and cheese or a milkshake, right? And so good options. Yeah, so think about things that are sweet, right? Some of us have savory preferences. Oh yeah, these are all great. Sushi's a good one. Watermelon, ramen, delicious, right? And everyone has these different preferences, but they're so important to us and they're delicious, right? Loaded fries, excellent. And if you click one more time, right? Also, why do you think that these are your favorite foods, right? Based on what we just thought about today, what's in these foods, right? Do we have any general trends? Is there lots of certain nutrients that we like? Are there micronutrients that we might think are delicious? Are there visual or social or even nostalgic components of these foods that's more delicious to us? Um, and you click again, have these always been your favorite foods? Is something that's interesting to think about. Yeah, high sucrose content and low temperature milkshake. And how have your tastes changed? I know for myself, I used to absolutely hate olives when I was a child, and now I love olives. I can eat a whole jar of them in one go. Um, and things change, as we progress, and maybe there's something to do right with what we need and what our body's telling us we need. Um, and an important thing to do also, I just wanted to mention, is that preferences are a difficult thing to braces is a good example, right? When you get your braces off, suddenly you can have foods you haven't had for a while. It's very exciting. It tastes more delicious. But we can't really measure preferences that well because preferences are very fallible, right? When you say that you like something, you might think that you like something and you go back and try it again and go, well, that wasn't as good as I expected. Not that people lie, but it's that preferences are amorphous, right? They don't have any hard evidence necessarily. And so what we do in this field of research is we observe choices using a binary choice task, which is you give someone two options and you say, pick which one. And then you observe them make a bunch of choices over and over again. And then you use those choices as evidence to define their preferences. So, you can think about that. I used to say maybe that my favorite food was pizza. But then every time I went to go get lunch, I noticed myself getting the sushi instead, the takeaway sushi instead. And so then maybe over time, my preferences have shifted. Or as I've grown or I've started a new sport, my body had different metabolic needs. Um, so I just basically wanted to pose this discussion because your favorite food tells you a bit about what you are and what you need and what you want. Um, and it's very interesting to think about. We're still learning a lot in this field of nutrition. Um, but right, there's general trends. And also something interesting, just from looking at what everyone said, people think that they like sugar, they have a sweet tooth, or they like savory things more. But a lot of times, the best foods, what people's preferences are, these things fly together. And so if you think about something like, I just saw someone say a macaron, right? You might think, oh, that's sugar, but it has fat in it as well. If you think of something like a chocolate chip cookie, that's sugar, but there's so much butter because it makes it taste so good. Sushi is my favorite because I love the protein. I think it's delicious, and I also like the saltiness of it as well. Um, so that's why it's my favorite, I think. Also, I don't think I've ever been satisfied. I could probably eat sushi until, I don't know, the cows come home, to use a food-related reference. But my point is that when you think of things as being a sweet, they usually have fat in it as well. When you think of things being savory, they also usually have sugar in it. Ramen typically has a decent amount of sugar in the broth. Lots of sauces that we put on savory things, barbecue sauce, brown sauce, ketchup, they have a bit of sugar in it as well. It's because these two things together are just delicious, right? There was a great paper, I think DeFelice Antonio et al. In the past 10 years or so, showing that the title is The Supra-Additive Effects of Fat and Sugar. They found that when sugar and fat occur together, they are greater in valuation than the sum of their parts. So you might like the sugar one this much and the fat one that much, but when you combine them, it's not this plus that, it's this plus that and a bit more. It's an interesting thing to think about why it might be that way. Moving on to slide 39, what's the future of food, right? Let's have a nice little milkshake here. Food engineering, right? So part of my funding comes from us trying to understand the way this part of the brain works so that we can create viable alternatives, right? There are relatively few examples of foods where the diet option is better. Maybe Diet Coke is a good example. If you click again, we also need to do a lot more research, right? Like I said, we don't know which is the best diet. We're still trying to understand that. Also, there's differences between people, but there's the microbiome you might have heard about, the gut-brain axis. There's more neurons in your digestive tract than there are in your brain. So you got to understand how that works a bit better. There's increasing food allergies. I'm not sure. Maybe there's better evidence about why that is. That could be related. And there's also things like printed or artificial engineered meat, or different kinds of things like that. There's lots of companies doing vegan alternatives that are really interesting. So we're at this interesting phase now where we're building and we're understanding kind of the building blocks of food. And if we can continue to understand how we like food, then we probably have a lot of interesting things coming out. So that's kind of the general point. I have some resources here on slide 40 for you if you want to check out other things. And that comes to the conclusion. I think we want to have a couple of questions here at the end. So if you want to post something in the chat, I'm happy to answer it. And thank you again for coming to the talk. I appreciate everyone's attendance and sorry for the difficulties at the beginning. Yeah, all right. So why do people have food aversions? That's a great question. There's a lot of different things that can impact that. Um, I'm not exactly sure, it's not my background on why people might have different food aversions that aren't related just to these kind of basic sensory processes. But a good example of kind of a food aversion would be something like, sensory specific satiety can also play into it, right? If you've had too much of something and you don't want it, your body doesn't need it anymore. It's coming from like a metabolic and desire perspective. If your body doesn't need any more salt, you're going to not crave foods that have as much of that anymore. And that can apply to a couple different things. But I'm not exactly sure. It's a great question. Another good one. Does texture ever trump taste in terms of preference? Yeah. So, what I would say is the best way to think about these nutrients interacting is not that one of them beats out the others to then win, and then that's how you make your choice, but that they interact. So, our research found that the texture properties of these milkshakes specifically, right? So, the sliding friction, like how slippery something is, and also viscosity, how thick something is, were really implicated in how they made their choices, right? So it's significant impact on the choices. And what those did is they indicated how much fat was in something. So I would say maybe it's not that texture beats taste or the other ones, it's that texture contributes. So texture explains a lot of the choices, right? So we're not trying to say, which is the gladiator winner between this battle between the senses. It's which is potentially the more important one, and which one gives us the most information maybe about what's in these foods that we're looking for. Um, Would you say the food you eat impacts emotions? Absolutely, the food you eat impacts emotions. I mean, I always have impacts. I think people are just emotional eaters, right? It's a big thing because food is also thing. It gives us a dopamine rush. It makes us feel very positive, which is interesting, right? Maybe that kind of contributes to some of the negative things about food is that we use it as a behavioral control. Um, I wanted to answer them the questions about food related work or the kind of psychology behind it. There's a lot of food related work going on right now. I think there's many different parts of industry and science that are open to you. There's food engineering. There's work on kind of regulatory work with politics as well, especially as we have this flourishing development of new vegan and food alternatives. There's also agrarian or agricultural related fields you can work in related to kind of crop regulation, especially with climate shifting. If you're interested in that side of things, if you're interested in kind of the food sensory processing, I think this is also a really interesting field because I enjoy it because it has kind of traditional science. I do work in a lab, but I also have this very human interaction with people and discussing these ideas and these behavioral and psychological ideas. Um, so it's a very exciting field, and I think that you have a lot of different opportunities. And there's many different ways to get into it. The best course at Oxford, I'm not exactly sure what the best one would be. Experimental psychology has an undergraduate degree here. There's many things. I would recommend that you look at the website that I've included on the slides, but there's also, you can do biology as an undergrad. You can do many things as an undergrad. Like I said before, because the field of food science is so broad and has so many different kind of ways into it and aspects to it, from political to the sensory work to the food engineering work. There are many different ways, and whatever is the most exciting for you kind of on your way to food, I think you should take that direction. um, do I think that food that is specifically engineered to maximize nutrition could ever completely replace normal food? That's a great question. I'm not sure. I think that what I would say is that that is maybe an oversimplification when people think that we can design foods that well at this point. If you look at kind of the retro futuristic newspapers from like 100 years ago, 75 years ago, and they say, oh, in the year 2000, people will just take a pill with all your day-tree vitamins, your daily whatever, and you'll be good to go. But um, right, we don't really understand, I think, foods quite well enough to do that. We're close, right? People can survive with very engineered diets, but also that limits the entire aspect of the human kind of condition of eating food. People love to eat food. The hospitality and restaurant industry is massive because people love to eat, right? 3D printing, food printing is absolutely possible and already happens, right? They have printed steaks. But right, we need to make sure that these designs and engineered things kind of become good, right? Like I was saying before, what I'm trying to do is understand the mechanism of how we sense these foods so that we can make kind of these better and almost as good, maybe lower fat or lower sugar, or lower salt options to replace other things to help with diets, because realistically, people are going to eat things that they want to eat. And we need to understand more so that we can design foods that are as good as normal food. That's great. A compliment, not too sweet for hyping up desserts. Absolutely. I think that because there's something called saccharin. This word saccharin is things are too sweet, right? And I'm not exactly sure how that works, but there's a balance, right, between these kind of things. I think for one last question. My thoughts specifically on genetically modified food and crops. I think that it's a little bit over sensationalized in the news, just because genetically modified crops can be things that, and try to fortify them against pests, which might have harmful effects, or they can be genetically modified to be bigger, right? Like a classic example of these kind of apples, like delicious red apples you've seen all the stores, which I'm not sure if it's GMO or if they're just artificially selected, but they don't taste good, right? They're made to look perfect, but they don't actually taste as good, right? And the thing is, you have larger tomato varieties, which are massive, but they don't have the flavor. And so there's some negatives with GMOs, especially with GMOs that have, certain negative properties like that. But also an important example to think on the other side is that fortified rice and things like that are also GMOs, and they have saved millions of people worldwide from starvation, and increased kind of their nutrients on the daily intake, right? Iron fortified rice and things like that. So, or iodine, I mean. So GMOs are complex, and as with most things, right, the answer is always it depends. But it's an important thing, especially as we think about kind of food and sustainability of food and agriculture going into the future. So what I would say is generally, don't paint anything with a single brush, right, when you think about GMOs, but seek to go with foods, I think, that are less processed in general. It's kind of related to that. All right, I think that's all the time we have today. Again, thank you everyone so much for tuning in, and appreciate your patience at the beginning.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thank you. It's really interesting sat listening for what I could hear, because I had my own IT issues going on as well. But yeah, thank you all for your patience. I appreciate it was a bit chaotic at the beginning, but we got through it. So yeah, thank you everybody. Have a lovely evening. All the best. Take care. Bye.